So I have to ask on several aspects of China. First, on the president, the meeting. You helped set up a first call and first meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. Can you tell the story of that? Because that's also interesting. Again, that first phone call, the reaching out, the
Yeah.
forming the human connection, which ultimately leads to the connection between nations and the
So,
possibility of collaboration.
so during the transition, President Trump took a call from the head of Taiwan, and that sent the Chinese into a real tailspin. And he didn't do it, I think, to be provocative to them as much as just as a businessman. He felt you answer your call. Somebody wants to speak to you, you speak to him. Like you want to have conversations, hear their point of view. But it was taken as a very big insult, and it was against tradition and norm. Um, and so that was something that set us off in a wrong direction. My view at the time was that, we are kind of entering a G2 world, whether people want to admit it or not. And that a lot of these countries in what I call the middle market countries were basically playing this when China was being aggressive with their One Belt, One Road. They were basically playing US and China against each other. And I thought that by the two leaders coming together, there were some things they wouldn't agree on. But there was a lot that they probably could agree on, which could lead to um, resolutions to a lot of issues in the world. That was like my most optimistic view. My most more pragmatic view was that President Trump had very big issues on trade that he wanted to get to with China. He felt like China, their trade practices were unfair. They weren't following all the global rules of trade. He was a little bit nervous that they would be provocative with Taiwan. And I felt like the two of them getting together would be the best way to try and resolve that. So the Chinese are very proud, and a lot of it is about face. And so in order to negotiate for that first call, we basically agreed on what would happen in the call. So not let's just have a call, say, hi, nice to meet you. It was a question of President Trump basically agreed that he would acknowledge the one China policy, which he didn't see as a big concession because you could always unacknowledge it the next day. So yeah, I'll acknowledge it and then we'll go. And in exchange, President Xi was going to come over to the US for a visit so they could sit together. And they wanted to do it outside the White House. And so we agreed on Mar-a-Lago, which I also thought was good because President Trump always felt much more comfortable when he was hosting
Mhm.
at his properties, and he just felt at home. And so he liked having people as his guests, and he loved it. He always felt really relaxed, and it was great. So that was really what we did. Then the Chinese come over, very much anticipated visit, and it was incredible. So they were supposed to sit together for 15 minutes. And they spent about an hour and a half together. And during that meeting, President Trump, they said, look, let's just set some ground rules to this relationship. Like, let's just not talk about Taiwan. Like, just don't do anything. I don't want it on the table. If it does, I'm going to have to do harsh things.
Mhm.
I just don't want this to be a problem for 4 years. We got bigger issues. They basically just, again, you notice 4 years of Trump administration, no Taiwan talk whatsoever. It was a non-issue. Started talking about the trade issues. They spent a lot of time on North Korea. President Trump was trying to get the perspective from President Xi about North Korea because that was, again, considered from Obama the biggest national security issue that we faced at the time, and they just had a good feeling for each other. It also helped that my wife and I we actually had a Chinese nanny and teacher in our house, and our kids learned fluent Mandarin. And our daughter actually opened when President Xi and President Trump were together with Melania and with Madame Peng. My daughter actually sang them a couple of Chinese songs, and I thought that was a nice way to show, we're tough, but we respect your culture, because the Chinese have an incredible culture that goes back thousands of years. They're very proud in how they do it, and I think that sign of respect also set things off in a very warm way for President Trump to say, my granddaughter speaks Chinese, and we're showing you the respect, which I think is very important. And he did have respect for them. The next part about the visit, I mean, obviously we had a lot of discussions on trade, but the part that was probably most impactful to me was President Xi basically did an hour monologue at lunch where he just went through uh, Chinese history from his perspective. And he talked about, with particular emphasis on kind of the Treaty of Unequals and then the 100 Years of Humiliation. And then you go through from Mao all the way to today, and you had, China coming back and rising. And you could tell that he was learned the lessons from the past and was very committed to kind of seeing China go through. So that was a different time, right? So China today is different than it was in 2017. In 2017, I remember President Xi was at Davos and he was feted by all the top business people in the world as Donald Trump was the threat to the global world order. President Xi was the champion of free trade and the biggest champion of environmentalism and fighting for climate change. Um, and what occurred was President Trump came in and basically said, like, I think China has not been following the rules-based order. Took very, very drastic approaches with tariffs. Every time he would do the tariffs again, I had Mnuchin, our Treasury Secretary, come to Vonk my house. If he does this, this is going to crash the whole economy. I mean, and by the way, he believed it. I mean, these were things that people were telling him would be very tough to do. President Trump had a gentleman named Ambassador Lighthizer, Robert Lighthizer. He was really the tip of the spear on all of our trade negotiations. He worked very well with Secretary Mnuchin, and we ended up increasing tariffs to numbers that hadn't even been thought could happen. So we did the first round of tariffs. Then, the Chinese came back and retaliated very surgically, trying to hit us in all the areas that politically would have been difficult. And what Trump did was, instead of backing down, he took some of the revenue from the tariffs, gave it to the farmers and said, I know that this is going to hurt your business, but I'm going to make sure you guys are made whole. And then he doubled down and basically went back at the Chinese with even more tariffs. So what we watched over a year and a half was probably the biggest hand of poker that was ever played. And it was an amazing experience to be a part of it. And the role I played was really working for Secretary Mnuchin and Ambassador Lighthizer as a back channel with the Chinese to make sure we can just de-escalate things and get to solutions in the best way possible. And so anyway, it was a fascinating time. But if you think about the global awareness of the bad practices that China was putting in place today versus what they were in 2016, I think one of President Trump's most successful policies was shifting the way the entire world understood the threat of China and then putting in place the beginning of a regime to try and rebalance the world so that we could have more economic parity.
So you mentioned to me the book, The 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury, when we discussed China. And I've gotten a chance to read parts of it. And I'd highly recommend people read it because there's it's definitely an eye-opening perspective. I don't know if I agree with all of it. I don't know if you agree with all of it, but it certainly it gives a very intense perspective on China. And you said it was instructive to how Donald Trump thought about China. Can you describe the main thesis of the book and maybe with a hopeful view, how it's possible to have a trajectory of these two superpowers working together in the 21st century versus fighting against each other?
Perfect. So it's a very, very big book, and I think it's a book definitely worth reading. Michael is tremendous. He speaks fluent Mandarin, and so he spent a lot of time researching to do the book. So I highly recommend it to everyone. And it was considered more of a fringe perspective in 2016, but it really, I think, came to represent the underpinning of what the collective thought was of the Trump administration. And maybe you could argue that it was even more cynical. The whole thesis of the book was that China from 1949 to 2049 was working to reclaim their position as the global leader, right? So you had the Chinese Empire. One of the things, I don't know if it's from this book or a different book that I read, that spoke about how in the late 1700s, basically the emperor of China was offered some of the industrial capability from England, which was basically now becoming the Industrial Revolution, and basically said, no, we're fine. We're the great Chinese Empire. We don't need any of these things. We're better than that. And by rejecting that, the rest of the world got stronger. China remained weaker. Then you had the opium wars. The Chinese had big opium problems through all the trade back and forth. And then China from about 1840 to 1940 had 100 years where they really, after all these treaties, were really a second-class country. And so then you have the People's Revolution that comes in, and he talks about how China, very strategically, as a very, very poor country, would fight their way back and build brick by brick. And, he proffers in the book that Nixon didn't go to China and open China. It was China that actually went to Nixon and was able to use Nixon in order to open up. And then they talk about how under Carter, they were able to get the U.S. to contribute to a lot of their they were able to kind of start borrowing the U.S. know-how from our university systems, from our medical, from our science, from our research. And the whole notion that was the conventional thinking of American leaders was that the more we helped China advance, the more they would become a free market economy. And it was a great market. The only difference was that they weren't allowing us access. They were making our companies basically give them all of their technical knowledge. They were stealing our intellectual property. They were doing espionage to steal a lot of the patents. They were just ignoring our patents, and they weren't following any of the rules of international trade. Then they started becoming the world's manufacturing hub. They basically became the world's factory. And then they started this whole initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative in order to start locking in their lines of trade. So they were buying up all the ports everywhere. They were building railways, thinking, how do we lock in our distribution so that we can maintain the dominance as the world's global factory? And so it was a brilliant long-term plan that they were doing. And by raising awareness, by putting the tariffs, Trump slowed them down a lot. The real question is if they actually did achieve this full objective of becoming the world dominant country, what they would have done with it, whether they would have been nefarious or not. I think from my perspective, even with some of the divisions and issues we have now in America, I still would rather an American-led world order than a Chinese-led world order. But the notion is that they were playing a very zero-sum game and really going to be the dominant leader in this new world order. So that really framed the perspective. And it wasn't necessarily, people ask me and the Chinese were always fearing, is Trump trying to stop our rise, right? And you have a great book also by Graham Allison that he writes about, are we destined for war between the US and China? And he goes through different historical times where you have a power and a rising superpower. And I think, more than half the time it ends up leading to war. So the question is what's going to happen here? And I do think that Trump's perspective, and this is my interpretation, because everything was always tactical day to day. And, he was unpredictable to the Chinese, which they couldn't deal with. And he was unpredictable even to his team sometimes because he was playing it day by day and issue by issue and always changing and adjusting, which is how an entrepreneur thinks. He respected the job they did by building their country. They moved 300 million people out of poverty into the middle class. They did it at the expense of a lot of other countries throughout the world, especially America. But Trump says, look, stupid politicians made deals. I respect China for doing what they did. But what I want to do is I want to change the paradigm so that for the next 20 years, we can maintain our advantage over them. We can maintain our competitive dynamic. And, his general view was that America is the best private sector in the world. We have a lot of the best minds in the world. And if we can just have a level playing field with set rules, then America should be able to outperform. And so that's really what we were trying to do. We were trying to kind of get rid of some of their state subsidies, make them follow some of these international rules of trade, and not allowing them to do predatory investments that then undercut different industries that we had, so that they can have global market dominance or monopolies on different industries, and then have pricing power, but also geopolitical power. So, like one of the examples that people talk about now is China for the last 20 years was very advanced on seeing this electrification trend. They subsidized solar panels. A lot of the American solar panel players were put out of business. So now I think it's like 90+% of solar panels in the world are manufactured in China. And then all the rare earths that you need in order to make these solar panels and to make these electric vehicles, China's bought up most of them and a lot of the refining capacities in China. So thinking through strategically, how do we create an even playing field so that we're not at the mercy of them, and how you can have a rules-based world order, that was really kind of the thought of what we were trying to work towards.